a kiss that signed her death warrant. Aurora Darasi had spent years pretending she didn't know the truth. But when she uncovered a secret she was never meant to find, she made the mistake of thinking she could run. And now, standing in her doorway, was the man sent to bring her back. Tommaso Benedetti exhaled slowly, shaking his head. "You should have stayed hidden, Dulcezza," he murmured. "Now, I'll make sure you never run again." Chapter 1. The Whisper of Forgotten Truths. The late afternoon sun cast long, melancholic shadows across the worn, terracotta tiles of Aurora Darasi's modest apartment. Dust motes danced in the golden light, illuminating the sparse furnishings, a testament to a life lived in the margins, a life carefully curated to attract no attention. Aurora, a woman whose age sat gracefully upon her, somewhere in the vicinity of 60, moved with a quiet, deliberate energy, her hands, gnarled with time and experience, carefully arranging a vase of wilting sunflowers on a small, round table. She paused, her gaze drifting to the window, overlooking a bustling Roman street. The sounds of the city, the cacophony of Vespas buzzing like angry wasps, the animated chatter of neighbors, the distant wail of a siren usually provided a comforting backdrop to her solitude. Today, however, they grated on her nerves, each sound a sharp reminder of the world she had tried so desperately to leave behind. 20 years. 20 years since she had walked away, changed her name, dyed her hair once a vibrant auburn, now a muted, unassuming brown, and meticulously crafted a new identity. Aurora Rossi, the quiet, unassuming widow, was a far cry from Aurora Darasi, the daughter of a powerful mafia don, a woman who had once moved through a world of opulent villas, whispered secrets, and ever-present danger. She touched her cheek, tracing the faint line of a scar that ran from her temple to her jaw, a souvenir from a life she had desperately tried to bury. A life of fear, yes, but also of a fierce, protective love, a love that had ultimately forced her to make the most agonizing choice of her life. A choice to protect her child. The memory surfaced unbidden, sharp and painful as a shard of glass. Her daughter, Isabella. The image of her, a small, dark-haired child with eyes the color of the deepest sapphire, was etched into Aurora's soul. Isabella, who would be a woman grown now, a woman Aurora had never known. A sudden, sharp rap on the door sent a jolt of adrenaline through her, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She froze, her hand instinctively reaching for the small, antique pistol she kept hidden beneath a loose floorboard under the rug. It was a relic from her past, a heavy, cold comfort in a world that still felt precarious, even after all these years. She peered through the peephole, her breath catching in her throat. Standing on her doorstep was a man, tall and imposing, his presence filling the small hallway outside her apartment. He was dressed impeccably in a dark suit, his black hair, streaked with silver at the temples, slicked back from a face that was both strikingly handsome and deeply unsettling. His eyes, the color of polished obsidian, seemed to pierce through the metal of the door, holding her captive in their gaze. Tommaso Benedetti. The name echoed in her mind, a chilling whisper from the past. He was a ghost, a phantom from a life she thought she had escaped. Tommaso, her father's most trusted enforcer, a man known for his ruthless efficiency and unwavering loyalty. A man she had once, in the foolish innocence of her youth, considered a friend. Her hand trembled as she slowly unlatched the chain, her mind racing, desperately searching for an explanation, an escape. There was none. The past, it seemed, had finally caught up with her. She opened the door, the hinges groaning in protest, a sound that mirrored the turmoil within her. The scent of his cologne, a subtle blend of sandalwood and something darker, something dangerous, filled her senses, instantly transporting her back to the opulent, suffocating world of her family's villa. "Aurora," he said, his voice a low, resonant rumble that sent shivers down her spine. It wasn't a question, but a statement, a confirmation of the identity she had so carefully concealed. There was a hint of something else in his tone, a subtle undercurrent of regret. She met his gaze, forcing herself to stand tall, to project an air of calm she didn't feel. "Tommaso," she replied, her voice surprisingly steady. What a surprise. He didn't smile. His eyes, those dark, unreadable eyes, searched her face, as if looking for something, some sign of the woman she had once been. "You've aged well, Aurora," he said, his gaze lingering on the lines around her eyes, the faint scar that marred her cheek. "Life in hiding has suited you." "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, the life feeling heavy and clumsy on her tongue. He raised an eyebrow, a silent acknowledgement of her deception. "Don't insult my intelligence, Dulcezza. We both know why I'm here." The word, Dulcezza, a term of endearment, felt like a slap in the face, a cruel reminder of the intimacy they had once shared, an intimacy that had been shattered by betrayal and loss. "I made a life for myself," Aurora said, her voice hardening. "A peaceful life. I want no part of that world anymore." Tommaso Benedetti exhaled slowly, the sound like the hiss of a deflating tire. He stepped closer, his presence dominating the small entryway. The air crackled with an unspoken tension, a dangerous dance of power and vulnerability. He shook his head slightly, a flicker of sadness crossing his features. "You should have stayed hidden, Dulcezza," he murmured, his voice barely a whisper. "Now," he continued, his voice turning cold and hard, "I'll make sure you never run again." The fear that had been simmering beneath the surface finally erupted, a cold wave washing over her. She had known, deep down, that this day might come. But she had hoped, prayed, that she had been forgotten, that the past had been buried deep enough to never resurface. The single and simple sentence he spoke was a reminder that such hopes are always vain. Chapter 2. Shadows lengthen on cobblestone streets. The weight of Tommaso's words pressed down on Aurora, suffocating her with the realization of her precarious situation. The carefully constructed facade of her quiet life crumbled around her, revealing the raw, vulnerable truth beneath. She was no longer Aurora Rossi, the unassuming widow. She was Aurora de Rossi, and she was trapped. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper, the fight draining out of her. Tommaso stepped fully into the apartment, closing the door behind him with a soft click that echoed like a gunshot in the sudden silence. He moved with a grace that belied his size, his presence filling the small space, making it feel even more claustrophobic. His gaze swept over the room, taking in the simple furnishings, the faded photographs on the wall, images of a life carefully fabricated, a life that now felt like a distant dream. "I want you to come with me," he said, his voice devoid of any emotion, a stark contrast to the turmoil raging within her. "And if I refuse?" she asked, knowing the answer, but needing to hear it, needing to defy him, even if it was only in words. His eyes, those dark, impenetrable pools, met hers. "You won't," he said simply. "You have no choice." He was right, of course. She had known that from the moment she saw him standing on her doorstep. Running was no longer an option. She had been found, and the consequences, whatever they may be, were unavoidable. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly, betraying the fear she was trying so hard to conceal. "Back," he said, the word hanging heavy in the air, laden with unspoken meaning. Back to the world she had fled, back to the family she had betrayed, back to the life she had desperately tried to escape. She thought of Isabella, her daughter, the reason for her flight, the reason for her sacrifice. Had they found her too? Was that why Tommaso had come? The thought sent a fresh wave of panic through her, a desperate need to protect her child, even after all these years. "My daughter," she said, her voice cracking with emotion. "What about Isabella?" Tommaso's expression softened, a flicker of something akin to sympathy crossing his features. "She's safe," he said, his voice gentler now. "She's waiting." Waiting? What did that mean? Was Isabella a prisoner, like she was about to become? Or was she part of the reason for Aurora's forced return? The questions swirled in her mind, unanswered, adding to the growing sense of dread. He gestured towards the door. "We should go. It's not safe to linger." Aurora hesitated, her gaze lingering on the small, familiar space that had been her sanctuary for so long. It was just an apartment, a collection of walls and furniture, but it represented her freedom, her independence, her carefully constructed identity. Leaving it felt like leaving a part of herself behind, a part she knew she might never recover. But she had no choice. She took one last, lingering look around, her eyes tracing the faded wallpaper, the worn rug, the wilting sunflowers on the table, remnants of a life that was now over. Then, with a heavy heart, she followed Tommaso out the door, stepping back into the shadows of her past. The streets of Rome, once a comforting backdrop to her quiet life, now felt menacing, filled with unseen dangers. The sounds of the city, the chatter of the crowds, the rumble of traffic, seemed to press in on her, amplifying her sense of unease. Tommaso walked beside her, his presence a silent, watchful guard, his hand hovering near the small of her back, a subtle reminder of his control. They walked in silence, the only sound their footsteps on the cobblestone streets, the rhythmic tap of their shoes echoing in the growing twilight. Aurora glanced at Tommaso, studying his profile, searching for some clue, some hint of what awaited her. His face was impassive, his eyes fixed straight ahead, revealing nothing. He led her through a maze of narrow, winding streets, away from the bustling tourist areas, towards a part of the city that felt older, darker, more secretive. The buildings here were taller, more imposing, their ancient facades casting long, ominous shadows that seemed to swallow the fading light. The air was thick with the scent of history, of secrets whispered in the dark, of blood spilled on the stones. She felt a growing sense of disorientation, a feeling of being lost in a labyrinth, both physical and emotional. The familiar landmarks of her adopted city seemed to fade away, replaced by a landscape that was both familiar and terrifyingly foreign. It was the landscape of her past, the world she had tried so desperately to escape, a world that was now closing in around her, reclaiming her, pulling her back into its suffocating embrace. As they turned a corner, a black car, sleek and ominous, pulled up beside them, the tinted windows obscuring the occupants within. The rear door opened silently, an invitation, or rather, a command. Tommaso gestured for her to enter. Aurora hesitated for a moment, her heart pounding in her chest, her mind screaming at her to run, to fight, to resist. But she knew it was futile. She was surrounded, trapped, with no escape. She took a deep breath, steeling herself for whatever awaited her, and stepped into the car, the door closing behind her with a final, resounding thud, sealing her fate. She could feel Tommaso's hand on her arm, a silent confirmation that she was his prisoner, at least for now. His eyes met hers, and for a moment, the tiniest of moments, she thought she saw something resembling understanding. Or was it pity? Chapter 3. The scent of roses and gunpowder. The interior of the car was plush and silent, a stark contrast to the bustling Roman streets outside. The leather seats were cool and smooth beneath Aurora's trembling hands. The air was thick with the scent of expensive cologne and something else, something faintly metallic, that sent a shiver of unease down her spine, the unmistakable scent of gunpowder. Tommaso sat beside her, his presence filling the confined space. He didn't speak, didn't look at her, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. The driver, a hulking figure with a shaved head and a neck thicker than Aurora's thigh, navigated the narrow streets with a practiced ease, his eyes darting constantly to the rear-view mirror. Aurora tried to control her breathing, to calm the frantic beating of her heart. She tried to focus on the details of the car, the stitching on the leather, the gleam of the chrome, anything to distract her from the overwhelming sense of dread that was consuming her. She wondered where they were going. Back to the villa, most likely. The thought sent a fresh wave of fear through her. The villa, her childhood home, a place of both opulent beauty and unspeakable horror, a place where she had witnessed things that still haunted her nightmares. She remembered the sprawling gardens, filled with fragrant roses and ancient olive trees, the scent of jasmine and lavender heavy in the air. She remembered the grand ballroom, with its glittering chandeliers and polished marble floors, where she had danced the night away, oblivious to the darkness that lurked beneath the surface of her family's glamorous life. And she remembered the hidden rooms, the soundproof chambers where her father conducted his business, where men disappeared, never to be seen again. The whispers, the rumors, the veiled threats, all part of the fabric of her life, a constant reminder of the power her father wielded, the power that had ultimately driven her away. She glanced at Tommaso, trying to read his expression, to find some clue, some hint of what awaited her. His face was still impassive, a mask of carefully controlled neutrality. But she noticed the subtle tension in his jaw, the way his fingers drummed lightly on his knee, betraying a nervousness that he was trying to conceal.
"Why?"
she asked, her voice barely a whisper, breaking the heavy silence that had fallen between them. Tommaso turned to her, his dark eyes meeting hers. For a moment, she saw a flicker of something in their depths: sadness, regret, perhaps even a hint of compassion. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by the familiar, impenetrable mask. "It's not my place to say," he said, his voice low and even. "You'll find out soon enough." His words offered no comfort, only fueling her anxiety. The unknown was always more terrifying than the known, and the unknown stretched before her like a vast, dark abyss. The car continued its journey, weaving through the increasingly deserted streets. The city lights grew sparser, replaced by the faint glow of the moon, casting long, eerie shadows that danced on the walls of the ancient buildings. They were leaving Rome behind, heading towards the outskirts of the city, towards the countryside, towards the villa. Aurora closed her eyes, trying to block out the growing sense of dread. She pictured Isabella, her daughter, her reason for everything. She clung to the hope that Isabella was safe, that she was not being punished for Aurora's sins. She remembered the day she had left, the agonizing choice she had made. She had kissed Isabella goodbye, whispering promises she knew she might not be able to keep, and then she had slipped away into the night, leaving her child behind, trusting that her family, despite their flaws, would protect her. It had been the hardest thing she had ever done, the most painful sacrifice she had ever made. And now, 20 years later, she was being forced to face the consequences of that decision, to confront the ghosts of her past. The car slowed, turning onto a long, winding driveway, lined with towering cypress trees that swayed gently in the night breeze. The air here was cooler, fresher, scented with the familiar fragrance of pine and earth. Aurora's heart pounded in her chest, a drumbeat of fear and anticipation. Through the trees, she could see the villa, its imposing silhouette rising against the night sky, its windows glowing with a warm, inviting light. It looked exactly as she remembered it, a magnificent palace, a gilded cage. The car stopped in front of the massive, ornate doors. The driver got out and opened the rear door for Aurora, his expression unreadable. Tommaso nodded to her, a silent command to follow. She stepped out of the car, her legs feeling shaky and unsteady. The cool night air sent a shiver through her, despite the heavy shawl she had wrapped around her shoulders. She stood there for a moment, gazing up at the villa, her childhood home, her prison. The scent of roses, heavy and sweet, mingled with the faint, lingering odor of gunpowder, a potent reminder of the duality of her family's world, the beauty and the brutality, the love and the fear, all intertwined, inseparable. The villa, her past, their intertwined future, loomed over. Chapter 4. Echoes of a life left behind. As Aurora stepped through the imposing, intricately carved wooden doors of the villa, a wave of memories washed over her, both bittersweet and terrifying. The scent of beeswax and old wood, the hushed murmur of voices, the faint strains of classical music drifting from a distant room, it was all exactly as she remembered it, a perfectly preserved time capsule of her former life. The grand entrance hall was vast and opulent, with a soaring ceiling adorned with elaborate frescoes depicting scenes from Roman mythology. A massive crystal chandelier hung suspended like a frozen waterfall, casting a dazzling light on the polished marble floor. Antique furniture, upholstered in rich velvet and silk, lined the walls, interspersed with priceless works of art, paintings, sculptures, tapestries, a testament to her family's wealth and power. But beneath the surface of this opulent beauty, Aurora felt the familiar undercurrent of tension, the unspoken secrets that permeated every corner of the villa. It was in the air she breathed, in the shadows that danced in the corners of her eyes, in the hushed whispers of the servants who moved silently through the halls, their eyes averted, their expressions carefully guarded. Tommaso walked beside her, his presence a silent, watchful escort. He didn't speak, didn't offer any explanation, simply guided her through the familiar labyrinth of corridors towards the heart of the villa. They passed the grand ballroom, where she had once danced the night away, carefree and oblivious to the darkness that surrounded her. She could almost hear the echo of laughter, the swirl of music, the rustle of silk gowns. She remembered the handsome young men who had courted her, the veiled threats disguised as compliments, the constant pressure to marry well, to strengthen the family's alliances. They passed the library, with its floor-to-ceiling bookshelves filled with ancient tomes and leather-bound volumes. She remembered spending hours there, lost in the world of books, escaping the suffocating reality of her life. She remembered the secret conversations she had had with her grandfather, the only member of her family who had seemed to understand her yearning for something more, something beyond the confines of their world. Finally, they reached a set of double doors, intricately carved with scenes of hunting and feasting. Tommaso paused, his hand hovering over the ornate brass handle. He turned to Aurora, his dark eyes meeting hers. "He's waiting for you," he said, his voice low and devoid of any emotion. He, her father, Don Alessandro Derossi, the man who had ruled her life, the man who had orchestrated her marriage, the man who had driven her away, the man she hadn't seen in 20 years. Aurora's heart pounded in her chest, a mixture of fear and a strange, unexpected sense of anticipation. She had spent years hating him, blaming him for everything that had gone wrong in her life. But now, standing on the threshold of their reunion, she felt a flicker of something else, curiosity, perhaps even a sliver of hope. Tommaso pushed open the doors, revealing a large, dimly lit study. The room was dominated by a massive mahogany desk, littered with papers and documents. A fire crackled merrily in the hearth, casting a warm, flickering glow on the walls, lined with bookshelves and family portraits. And there, seated behind the desk, was her father. He had aged, of course. His once jet-black hair was now mostly silver, his face deeply lined, his shoulders slightly stooped. But his eyes, those piercing blue eyes that had always seemed to see right through her, were as sharp and intense as ever. He looked up as she entered, his gaze sweeping over her, taking in every detail of her appearance. He didn't speak, didn't smile, simply stared at her, his expression unreadable. The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy, laden with unspoken accusations, unanswered questions, and years of accumulated resentment. Aurora stood her ground, meeting his gaze, refusing to be intimidated. She had come this far, she had faced her fears, and she would not back down now. Finally, her father spoke, his voice raspy with age, but still carrying the weight of authority. "Aurora," he said, his voice a low rumble, "you've come home." It wasn't a question, but a statement, a declaration of ownership. She was his daughter, and she had returned to his domain. "I was brought home," she corrected him, her voice surprisingly steady. "Against my will." A flicker of something annoyance, perhaps even a hint of amusement, crossed his features. "You always were a stubborn child," he said. "And you always were a controlling tyrant," she retorted, the words spilling out before she could stop them. He chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "Perhaps," he conceded. "But I did what I thought was best for the family." "For the family?" she scoffed. "Or for yourself?" His eyes narrowed, the familiar spark of anger igniting in their depths. "Don't presume to question me, Aurora," he said, his voice hardening. "You know nothing of the sacrifices I've made, the burdens I've carried. And you know nothing of the life I've lived," she shot back, her voice trembling with emotion. The pain I've endured, the choices I've been forced to make. The fire crackled in the hearth, the only sound in the room, punctuating the tense silence that followed. He looked very tired, and for the first time, Aurora felt a prickle of
something.
Something that was neither fear nor anger, but perhaps something else, stirring, at the very edge of her mind. He looked defeated. Chapter 5. A Cage of Gilded Promises. The silence in the study was thick with unspoken words, a palpable tension that hung heavy in the air. Aurora and her father, Don Alessandro Derossi, stood locked in a silent battle of wills, their eyes meeting across the expanse of the mahogany desk, a chasm of years and resentment separating them. Alessandro finally broke the silence, his voice softer now, tinged with a weariness that Aurora had never heard before. "Sit down, Aurora," he said, gesturing towards a leather armchair positioned in front of the desk. She hesitated for a moment, her pride warring with her exhaustion. She was tired of fighting, tired of running, tired of the constant fear that had shadowed her life for so long. She sank into the chair, the soft leather conforming to her body, a small comfort in the midst of the overwhelming emotional turmoil. Alessandro leaned back in his chair, his gaze never leaving her. He studied her, his eyes taking in the changes that the years had wrought, the lines around her eyes, the silver streaks in her hair, the subtle hardening of her features. "You look like your mother," he said, his voice barely a whisper, a flicker of sadness in his eyes. The mention of her mother, a woman who had died when Aurora was still a child, a woman she barely remembered, sent a pang of unexpected grief through her. She had always felt a void in her life, a missing piece that her father had never been able to fill. "I remember her kindness," Aurora said, her voice soft, her gaze drifting towards the fire, the flames dancing in her eyes. "Something you seem to have forgotten." Alessandro sighed, a heavy, burdened sound. "Kindness has no place in our world, Aurora," he said. "It's a weakness, a vulnerability that our enemies will exploit." "And what about love?" she asked, her voice challenging him. "Is that a weakness too?" He didn't answer, his gaze shifting away from hers, his expression unreadable. He knew, as well as she did, that love had been the driving force behind her flight, the reason she had sacrificed everything to protect her daughter. "Isabella," he said, the name a quiet question, a test. Aurora's heart clenched. "What about her?" she asked, her voice sharp, defensive. "She's here," he said simply. "She's been waiting for you." Waiting? The word echoed in her mind, filled with both hope and apprehension. She had longed to see her daughter, to hold her in her arms, to tell her how much she loved her. But she had also feared this moment, feared the judgment in Isabella's eyes, the condemnation for the choices Aurora had made. "I want to see her," she said, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and anticipation.
Alessandro nodded. "Of course," he said.
"But first, we need to talk." He leaned forward, his hands clasped on the desk, his eyes locking with hers. "You were brought back here for a reason, Aurora," he said. "Things have changed. The family is facing challenges." Challenges? Aurora knew what that meant. It meant rivals, threats, the constant struggle for power that defined their world. It meant danger, for her and for Isabella. "What kind of challenges?" she asked, her voice wary. Alessandro hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "There are those who seek to undermine us," he said. "To take what is rightfully ours. Old enemies, new threats. It's a complicated situation." "And you need my help?" she asked, incredulous. After all these years, after everything he had put her through, he was asking for her help? "Not your help," he said, correcting her. "Your loyalty." Loyalty. The word hung heavy in the air, a loaded term in their world, a concept that demanded absolute obedience, unquestioning allegiance. It was a cage, a gilded cage, but a cage nonetheless. "And what if I refuse?" she asked, echoing the question she had asked Tommaso earlier. Alessandro's eyes hardened. "You have no choice, Aurora," he said, his voice cold and devoid of any emotion. "You are a Derossi. You belong here. And you will do what is required of you." His words were a stark reminder of her reality. She was trapped, bound by blood, by family, by a legacy of violence and power. She had tried to escape, to create a new life, but the past had caught up with her, pulling her back into its suffocating embrace. "And Isabella?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper, her fear for her daughter outweighing her own. "What role does she play in all of this?" Alessandro's expression softened slightly. "Isabella is the key," he said. "She is the future of the family. And you, Aurora, are the key to her future." His cryptic words, while offering the most basic of answers, also created more questions. How was Isabella the key? Was she being forced to play a certain part, perhaps follow in paths that Aurora had so desperately sought to avoid? The not knowing, the uncertainty, made the gilded cage of promises that much tighter. Chapter 6. The weight of unspoken words. The weight of Alessandro's words pressed down on Aurora, a heavy burden of unspoken implications and veiled threats. Isabella, the key, the future of the family. Her daughter, caught in the intricate web of mafia power struggles, a pawn in a game she had desperately tried to shield her from. "What do you mean, she's the key?" Aurora asked, her voice tight with anxiety, her hands clenching into fists in her lap. Alessandro leaned back in his chair, his eyes studying her, assessing her reaction. He seemed to be weighing his words carefully, deciding how much to reveal, how much to keep hidden. "Isabella has qualities," he said slowly, his voice deliberately vague. "Qualities that are valuable to the family. She has a strength, a resilience, that is rare. And she has a connection to certain individuals that could be beneficial to us."
Connection?
Aurora's mind raced, trying to decipher his cryptic words. What kind of connection? Was Isabella involved with someone powerful, someone dangerous? Was she being used as a bargaining chip, a tool to forge alliances? What individuals? She pressed, her voice sharp with suspicion. Alessandro hesitated, his gaze flickering towards the door, as if expecting someone to enter. He lowered his voice, leaning closer to Aurora. "The Veronas," he said, the name a whispered curse, a name that sent a chill of dread down Aurora's spine. The Veronas. The de Rossi family's oldest and most bitter rivals, a family with whom they had been engaged in a bloody feud for generations. A feud that had claimed countless lives, a feud that had fueled Aurora's nightmares since childhood. "What does Isabella have to do with the Veronas?" Aurora asked, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and disbelief. Alessandro sighed, running a hand through his silver hair, his expression weary.
"It's complicated," he said.
"There's been a proposal." A proposal. The word hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Aurora knew what kind of proposal he was talking about. A marriage proposal. A forced union, designed to end the feud, to unite the two families, to consolidate their power. "You're planning to marry her off to a Verona?" she asked, her voice rising in outrage, her hands shaking with anger. "After everything, after all the bloodshed, you're going to sacrifice her to them?" Alessandro's eyes flashed with anger. "Don't be foolish, Aurora," he said, his voice hardening. "It's not a sacrifice. It's a strategic alliance. It's the only way to ensure the family's survival." "Survival?"
she scoffed.
"At what cost? Her happiness? Her freedom? Her life?" "She will be protected," he said, his voice firm, unwavering. "She will be the wife of a powerful man, the future head of the Verona family. She will have everything she could ever want, everything except the one thing she truly desired, the freedom to choose her own destiny, the freedom to love whom she pleased, the freedom to live a life free from fear and violence." "I won't allow it," Aurora said, her voice rising in defiance, her eyes blazing with determination. "I won't let you use her like that. I left to protect her from this, and I won't let you drag her back into it." Alessandro leaned forward, his eyes locking with hers, his expression intense. "You have no say in the matter, Aurora," he said, his voice cold and unforgiving. "Isabella is a de Rossi. She has a duty to the family, and she will fulfill that duty whether you like it or not." His words were a slap in the face, a harsh reminder of her powerlessness. She was trapped, caught in a web of family obligations and ancient vendettas. She had no control, no agency, no way to protect her daughter from the fate that awaited her. But she wouldn't give up. She wouldn't surrender. She would fight, even if it was a losing battle. She would find a way to protect Isabella, to free her from the clutches of the mafia, to give her the life she deserved. "I want to see her," Aurora said, her voice firm, despite the tremor in her hands. "I want to talk to her. I want to hear it from her own lips." Alessandro hesitated, his gaze flickering towards the door again. He seemed to be weighing the risks, the potential consequences of allowing Aurora to see Isabella. "Very well," he said finally, his voice grudging. "But you will be careful what you say. You will not interfere. You will not try to poison her mind against the family." His words were a warning, a threat. He was giving her a chance, a small window of opportunity, but he was also making it clear that he was still in control. And he, Tommaso, and every member of this family would make sure she toed the line. He would ensure her obedience, with any means necessary. He stood up, gesturing towards the door. "Tommaso will take you to her," he said. Aurora rose from her chair, her legs feeling weak and unsteady. She followed Tommaso out of the study, her heart pounding in her chest, a mixture of hope and dread swirling within her. She was about to see her daughter, the child she had sacrificed everything for, the child who was now a woman she barely knew. But that woman, that same daughter, was also at risk, dangled like a bauble to maintain some semblance of peace between two warring, powerful families. Chapter 7. Scars that time cannot erase. Tommaso led Aurora through a maze of corridors, their footsteps echoing softly on the polished marble floors. The villa was silent, save for the occasional murmur of voices from behind closed doors, the faint clinking of silverware from the dining room, where the family was presumably gathered for dinner. Aurora's mind raced, her thoughts a whirlwind of anxiety and anticipation. She was about to see Isabella, her daughter, after 20 long years. She wondered what she would say, how she would explain her absence, how she would bridge the chasm of time and distance that separated them. She imagined Isabella as a woman, a grown-up version of the little girl she had left behind. She pictured her with her own dark hair, her sapphire blue eyes, her mother's gentle smile. But she also feared the changes that the years might have wrought, the scars that the mafia life might have left on her soul. Tommaso stopped in front of a door at the end of a long hallway, a door that was identical to all the others, except for a small, almost imperceptible marking above the frame, a tiny, carved rose, the symbol of the Derossi family. He turned to Aurora, his dark eyes meeting hers. "She's in there," he said, his voice low and even. "Be careful what you say." His words were a reminder of Alessandro's warning, a subtle threat that hung heavy in the air. Aurora nodded, her throat too tight to speak. She reached for the doorknob, her hand trembling slightly. She took a deep breath, steeling herself for whatever awaited her, and pushed open the door. The room was a bedroom, large and luxurious, decorated in shades of cream and gold. The walls were adorned with paintings, the furniture was antique and elegant, the bed was a massive four-poster draped in silk and velvet. It was a beautiful room, a gilded cage, designed to confine and control. And there, standing by the window, gazing out at the moonlit gardens, was Isabella. She turned as Aurora entered, her eyes widening in surprise. She was even more beautiful than Aurora had imagined, a striking young woman with her father's dark hair, her mother's delicate features, and eyes that were the exact shade of the sapphires Aurora had always cherished. But there was something else in her eyes, something that sent a shiver of unease down Aurora's spine. A hardness, a coldness, a guardedness that spoke of a life lived in the shadows, a life shaped by the harsh realities of the mafia world.
"Mama,"
Isabella said, her voice a hesitant whisper, a question mark hanging in the air. Aurora's heart ached at the sound of that word, a word she had longed to hear for 20 years. She rushed towards her daughter, her arms outstretched, her eyes filling with tears. "Isabella," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "My darling girl." She embraced her daughter, holding her tight, her body trembling with a mixture of joy and relief. Isabella hesitated for a moment, her body stiff and unyielding, before finally returning the embrace, her arms wrapping around Aurora's waist. They stood there for a long moment, locked in an embrace, the silence broken only by Aurora's muffled sobs. It was a moment of reunion, of reconciliation, of a love that had endured despite the years of separation. But it was also a moment of unspoken questions, of hidden resentments, of a past that still cast a long shadow over their present. When they finally pulled apart, Aurora looked into her daughter's eyes, searching for some sign of recognition, some spark of the little girl she had left behind. "You've grown so much," Aurora said, her voice trembling, her hand reaching up to touch Isabella's cheek. "You're so beautiful." Isabella smiled, a faint, fleeting smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "You haven't changed much," she said, her voice surprisingly steady, her gaze assessing Aurora with a cool detachment. Aurora's heart sank. There was a distance between them, a wall that had been built up over the years, a wall that she didn't know how to break down. "I've missed you so much," Aurora said, her voice choked with emotion. "I've thought about you every day." Isabella's expression didn't change. "Why did you leave?" she asked, her voice blunt, direct, her eyes searching Aurora's face for answers. The question hung in the air, a heavy weight that Aurora had carried for 20 years. She had rehearsed her answer countless times, but now, faced with her daughter's accusing gaze, the words seemed inadequate, hollow. "It was complicated," Aurora said, her voice faltering. "I did it to protect you." "Protect me?" Isabella scoffed, a hint of bitterness in her voice. "From what? From our family? From our life? From the violence," Aurora said, her voice pleading. "From the danger. I didn't want you to grow up in that world." Isabella's eyes narrowed. "And you think you succeeded?" she asked, her voice laced with sarcasm. "Look around you, Mama. I'm still here. I'm still a Darasi. And I'm still living in that world." Her words were a sharp rebuke, a painful reminder of Aurora's failure. She had tried to protect her daughter, but she had only succeeded in abandoning her, leaving her to face the darkness alone. "I know," Aurora said, her voice barely a whisper. "And I'm so sorry." "Sorry." The word felt inadequate, insufficient to express the depth of her regret, the pain of her sacrifice. She had made a choice, a desperate gamble, and she had lost. And now, after everything, after all the time that had passed, Isabella stared back with eyes filled not with love, but with the barest glint of understanding, and perhaps something colder, something that suggested that a reckoning was near. Chapter 8. A dance of deception and desire. The air in Isabella's room was thick with unspoken tension, a mixture of resentment, regret, and a fragile, flickering hope for reconciliation. Aurora longed to reach out to her daughter, to bridge the gap that separated them, but she didn't know how. The years of absence, the secrets, the lies, had created a wall between them, a barrier that seemed insurmountable. Isabella turned away from Aurora, walking back towards the window, her gaze fixed on the moonlit gardens below. Her posture was stiff, her shoulders tense, her body language radiating a guardedness that broke Aurora's heart. "Grandfather told me about the proposal," Isabella said, her voice low and even, her back still turned to Aurora. Aurora's heart sank. So, Isabella knew. She knew about the arranged marriage, the forced union with the Veronas, the sacrifice that was being demanded of her. "What do you think about it?" Aurora asked, her voice hesitant, her heart pounding in her chest. Isabella turned back to face her, her expression unreadable, her eyes dark and enigmatic. "What choice do I have?" she asked, her voice devoid of any emotion. "It's my duty. It's what's expected of me." Her words were a chilling echo of her grandfather's, a reflection of the ingrained sense of obligation, the unquestioning loyalty that defined the mafia world. Isabella had been raised in this world, steeped in its traditions, its codes, its expectations. She had accepted her fate, resigned herself to the role that had been chosen for her. "You don't have to do it," Aurora said, her voice pleading, desperate to reach her daughter, to make her see that there was another way. There's always a choice. Isabella laughed, a short, bitter laugh that sent a shiver down Aurora's spine. You're naive, Mama, she said. You've been away too long. You don't understand how things work here. I understand that you're being forced into a marriage you don't want, Aurora said, her voice rising in anger. That you're being used as a pawn in a power game. It's not a game, Mama, Isabella said, her voice hardening. It's our life. It's the only way to ensure our survival, our family's survival. And what about your happiness? Aurora asked, her voice choked with emotion. Doesn't that matter? Isabella's expression softened slightly, a flicker of vulnerability crossing her features. Happiness is a luxury we can't afford, she said. Duty, loyalty, family, those are the things that matter. Aurora's heart ached for her daughter, for the life she had been forced to live, for the choices that had been taken away from her. She wanted to scream, to rage against the injustice of it all, but she knew it was futile. Isabella was a product of her environment, a prisoner of her upbringing. There's someone else, Isabella said suddenly, her voice barely a whisper, her gaze dropping to the floor. Aurora's heart skipped a beat. Someone else? Who? A lover? A secret romance? A glimmer of hope flickered within her. Perhaps Isabella wasn't as resigned to her fate as she seemed. Who? Aurora asked, her voice hesitant, afraid to break the fragile spell. Isabella hesitated, her fingers twisting together nervously.
His name is Marco, she said.
He's not one of us. Not one of us. The words hung in the air, laden with unspoken meaning. Marco was an outsider, someone outside the mafia world, someone who represented a different life, a different path. Do you love him? Aurora asked, her voice soft, her heart filled with a mixture of hope and trepidation. Isabella looked up, her eyes meeting Aurora's, a flicker of something that looked like defiance in their depths. Yes, she said, the word a whispered confession, a declaration of forbidden love. Aurora's heart soared. Isabella loved someone outside the family, someone who could potentially offer her an escape, a chance at a different life. But she also knew the dangers, the risks involved. A forbidden love in the mafia world was a dangerous game, a game that could have deadly consequences. A knock on the door interrupted their conversation, breaking the intimate moment. Tommaso entered the room, his expression impassive, his eyes scanning the scene, assessing the situation. It's time, he said, his voice devoid of any emotion. Your father wants to see you both. His words were a reminder of their reality, a reminder that they were not free, that they were still under the control of Don Alessandro de Rossi. Isabella's shoulders slumped, the flicker of hope in her eyes extinguished. The dance of deception and desire had ended, and once more the cold, harsh truth returned. Chapter 9. The Serpent in the Garden. Aurora and Isabella followed Tommaso through the labyrinthine corridors of the villa, their footsteps echoing softly on the marble floors. The silence was heavy, laden with unspoken tension, the weight of their shared predicament pressing down on them. Aurora glanced at Isabella, her heart aching for her daughter. She saw the resignation in her eyes, the subtle slump of her shoulders, the way her hands clenched into fists at her sides. Isabella was trapped, caught in a web of family obligations and ancient vendettas, and Aurora felt powerless to help her. They reached Alessandro's study, the same room where Aurora had confronted her father earlier. Tommaso opened the double doors, revealing the dimly lit space, the fire crackling merrily in the hearth, casting flickering shadows on the walls. Alessandro was seated behind his desk, his expression unreadable. But there was someone else in the room, a man standing by the window, his back to the door. He was tall and lean, with dark hair that curled at the nape of his neck, his posture radiating an air of confidence, of power. As Aurora and Isabella entered, the man turned, and Aurora's breath caught in her throat. He was strikingly handsome, with sharp features, a strong jawline, and eyes that were a piercing shade of green, eyes that seemed to bore into her soul. But there was something else about him, something unsettling, something that sent a shiver of unease down her spine. A coldness, a ruthlessness, a hint of danger that lurked beneath the surface of his charming exterior. "Aurora, Isabella," Alessandro said, his voice smooth and welcoming. "Allow me to introduce you to Lorenzo Verona." Verona. The name echoed in Aurora's mind, a chilling reminder of the family's bitter feud, the generations of bloodshed, the hatred that had defined their relationship. This was the man Isabella was supposed to marry, the man who represented the forced union, the sacrifice that was being demanded of her. Lorenzo Verona smiled, a slow, deliberate smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He stepped forward, his gaze sweeping over Aurora, assessing her, before settling on Isabella. "It's a pleasure to finally meet you," he said, his voice smooth and silky, a hint of an Italian accent coloring his words. He took Isabella's hand, raising it to his lips, his eyes locking with hers. "You are even more beautiful than the rumors suggested." Isabella didn't respond, her expression carefully guarded, her body language radiating a subtle tension. She didn't pull her hand away, but she didn't return his smile, her eyes betraying a flicker of what? Fear? Disgust? Resignation? Aurora felt a surge of anger, a protective instinct to shield her daughter from this man, this serpent who had slithered into their garden, threatening to destroy everything she held dear. "Lorenzo is here to discuss the arrangements," Alessandro said, his voice smooth, but with an underlying edge of steel. "The details of the alliance."
Alliance.
The word felt like a mockery, a euphemism for the forced marriage, the sacrifice that was being demanded of Isabella. Aurora wanted to scream, to protest, to refuse, but she knew it was futile. She was powerless, caught in a web of her father's making. "I'm sure you have much to discuss," Aurora said, her voice tight with controlled anger. "But I would like a moment alone with my daughter." Alessandro hesitated, his eyes narrowing slightly, assessing her intentions. He knew that Aurora was a threat, a potential obstacle to his plans. But he also knew that he couldn't completely alienate her, not yet. "Very well," he said grudgingly. "But be brief. We have much to do." He gestured towards the door, dismissing them. Aurora took Isabella's arm, leading her out of the study, back into the relative privacy of the corridor. "Don't do it, Isabella," Aurora said, her voice urgent, pleading. "Don't marry him. There has to be another way." Isabella looked at her, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and resignation.
"There is no other way, Mama," she said.
"It's my duty. It's what's expected of me." "But what about Marco?" Aurora asked, her voice desperate. "What about your love for him?" Isabella's expression flickered, a brief flash of pain crossing her features.
"Marco is a dream," she said.
"A fantasy. This is reality." "But it doesn't have to be," Aurora insisted. "We can find a way. We can escape. We can know," Isabella interrupted, her voice firm, resolute. "We can't. It's too late. The arrangements have been made. The deal is done." Her words were a final blow, a crushing defeat. Aurora's hope, her fragile belief that she could save her daughter, shattered into a million pieces. Isabella was lost to her, trapped in a gilded cage of her family's making. She knew that this serpent, Lorenzo, would not hesitate to use any means. She knew that any defiance would be met with force. She knew that even now they were being watched, every word, every glance monitored. Chapter 10. Fractured Reflections in a Broken Mirror. The weight of Isabella's resignation pressed down on Aurora, a suffocating blanket of despair. She had failed. She had tried to protect her daughter, to shield her from the darkness of the mafia world, but she had only succeeded in abandoning her, leaving her to face the consequences alone. They returned to Isabella's room, the silence between them heavy with unspoken emotions. Isabella walked towards the window, her gaze fixed on the moonlit gardens below, her posture radiating a sense of defeat, of acceptance. Aurora watched her, her heart aching for her daughter. She wanted to reach out to her, to comfort her, to tell her that everything would be all right, but she knew it was a lie. Nothing would be all right. Isabella was trapped, and Aurora was powerless to save her. "He's charming, isn't he?" Isabella said suddenly, her voice a soft, bitter whisper, breaking the silence. Aurora knew who she was talking about. Lorenzo Verona. The serpent. The man who was about to become her daughter's husband. The man who represented everything Aurora hated about the mafia world. He's dangerous, Aurora said, her voice tight with anger and fear. He's not what he seems. Isabella turned to face her, her eyes dark and enigmatic. And what is he, Mama?
She asked.
What do you see that I don't? Aurora hesitated, unsure how to answer. She had a feeling, a gut instinct, that Lorenzo Verona was not to be trusted, that he was hiding something, that he was more dangerous than he appeared. But she had no proof, no concrete evidence, only a vague sense of unease. I see a man who is used to getting what he wants, Aurora said slowly, choosing her words carefully. A man who will stop at nothing to achieve his goals. A man who is not afraid to use violence, to manipulate, to deceive. Isabella laughed, a short, bitter laugh that sent a shiver down Aurora's spine. You're describing every man in our world, Mama, she said. Including my grandfather. Including Tommaso. Her words were a harsh reminder of the reality of their situation. They were surrounded by men like Lorenzo Verona, men who ruled their lives, men who held their fates in their hands. But there's something different about him, Aurora insisted. Something colder. Something ruthless. Isabella's expression softened slightly, a flicker of vulnerability crossing her features. I know, she said, her voice barely a whisper. I see it too. But what choice do I have? You could run, Aurora said, her voice desperate, clinging to a sliver of hope. We could run together. We could disappear. We could start a new life, somewhere far away from here. Isabella shook her head, a sad smile playing on her lips. It's too late, Mama, she said. It's always been too late. I am a pawn in a game that began long ago. Aurora's hope died, just a bit more. The feeling of dread expanded. Isabella moved toward a vanity, sitting on the plush stool. She stared at her reflection, her eyes suddenly brimming. He's going to use me, Mama. Just like grandfather. Just like everyone. The tear that finally made its way down her perfect cheek was like acid on Aurora's soul. I'm so sorry, my baby. I'm so sorry, she said, moving toward her daughter, wanting nothing more than to wipe away the tears, to undo the years of choices that brought them here. Don't be, Isabella said, the words quick, as if she were afraid to show this much emotion. It's our way. Aurora placed her hand on Isabella's shoulder.
It does not have to be.
Isabella looked up at their reflections. For the briefest of moments, Aurora saw a different expression. Something stronger, something calculating. But it was gone so quickly. Isabella stood and turned to face Aurora. I need you to trust me, Mama. The words, and more so, the look in her eye, caught Aurora off guard. Trust you? Isabella nodded. Trust me. Please. The plea was desperate, raw. A plea Aurora had never seen in her adult daughter's eyes. Something was happening. Something was shifting. And Aurora, despite her fears, despite her doubts, had a tiny, flickering hope that maybe, just maybe, her daughter had a plan. A plan that would change everything. The reflection in the broken mirror wasn't fractured, after all. Chapter 11. The Price of Silence, the Cost of Truth. Aurora looked into Isabella's eyes, searching for some clue, some hint of what her daughter was planning. The plea for trust was unexpected, a stark contrast to the resignation she had witnessed earlier. Something had shifted, something had changed, but Aurora couldn't quite grasp what it was. Trust you to do what? Aurora asked, her voice hesitant, her mind racing, trying to decipher Isabella's cryptic words. Isabella's gaze was intense, unwavering, her eyes filled with a mixture of determination and a subtle fear that sent a shiver of apprehension down Aurora's spine. Just trust me, Isabella repeated, her voice a soft, urgent whisper. Don't ask questions. Don't interfere. Just let me handle things. Aurora's instinct screamed at her to question, to demand answers, to understand what Isabella was planning. But she also saw something in her daughter's eyes, something that resonated with her own rebellious spirit, her own desire to break free from the constraints of their world. She remembered the little girl she had left behind, the child who had always been strong-willed, independent, fiercely protective of those she loved. That spirit was still there, buried beneath the layers of obligation and resignation, but it was flickering, alive, refusing to be extinguished. "I don't understand," Aurora said, her voice shaking slightly. "What are you planning to do?" Isabella shook her head, her eyes darting towards the door, as if afraid of being overheard.
"I can't tell you," she said.
"Not yet. It's too dangerous. Just trust me, Mama. Please. It's the only way. The only way." The words hung heavy in the air, laden with unspoken meaning. The only way to what? To escape? To fight back? To survive? Aurora's heart pounded in her chest, a mixture of fear and a strange, unexpected surge of hope. She had spent years living in fear, running from her past, trying to protect her daughter from the darkness of the mafia world. But now, Isabella was asking her to trust her, to believe in her, to stand by her side as she faced that darkness head-on. It was a terrifying prospect, a dangerous gamble. But it was also a chance, a sliver of hope that maybe, just maybe, they could find a way out, a way to break free from the chains that bound them. "All right," Aurora said, her voice trembling but firm. "I trust you." Isabella's eyes filled with tears, a mixture of relief and gratitude. She reached out, taking Aurora's hand, her grip surprisingly strong. "Thank you, Mama," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "Thank you for believing in me." It was a moment of connection, of understanding, of a bond that had been strained but not broken. Aurora felt a surge of love for her daughter, a fierce, protective love that transcended everything else. A knock on the door interrupted their moment, breaking the spell. Tommaso entered the room, his expression impassive, his eyes scanning the scene, assessing the situation. "It's time for dinner," he said, his voice devoid of any emotion. "Don Alessandro is expecting you." His words were a reminder of their reality, a reminder that they were still prisoners, still under the control of Don Alessandro de Rossi. Isabella squeezed Aurora's hand, a silent reassurance, before releasing it. "We'll be right there," Isabella said, her voice surprisingly steady, her composure regained. Tommaso nodded, his gaze lingering on Aurora for a moment, a subtle warning in his eyes, before leaving the room. Aurora and Isabella followed him, walking side by side, their silence no longer heavy with unspoken tension, but filled with a shared secret, a shared purpose. They were entering a dangerous game, a game with unknown rules and potentially deadly consequences. But they were entering it together, united by a bond of love and a fierce determination to survive, and perhaps change the rules of their gilded cage. The dining room was grand and opulent, with a long, polished mahogany table set for a feast. Crystal chandeliers cast a dazzling light on the silverware and china, the air filled with the aroma of roasted meats, spices, and fine wine. Alessandro was seated at the head of the table, his expression unreadable. Lorenzo Verona sat to his right, his charming smile firmly in place, his eyes flickering with a subtle amusement. The other members of the family, cousins, uncles, aunts, were seated around the table, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and veiled hostility. Aurora and Isabella took their seats, the silence falling heavy around them. The price of silence, the cost of truth, were all around them. The meal began, a tense, formal affair, punctuated by forced conversation and strained pleasantries. Aurora picked at her food, her appetite gone, her mind racing, trying to anticipate what was to come. What was to come was a battle. She felt it in her very soul. Chapter 12. Whispers in the dark, promises in the light. The dinner progressed with a strained formality, a carefully choreographed dance of deception and veiled threats. Aurora picked at her food, her stomach churning with anxiety, her mind racing with 1,000 unanswered questions. Isabella, seated beside her, maintained a calm, composed demeanor, her expression carefully guarded, betraying nothing of the secret they shared. Lorenzo Verona dominated the conversation, his charming facade firmly in place, his eyes constantly flickering towards Isabella, assessing her, possessing her with his gaze. He spoke of the future, of the alliance between their families, of the power they would wield together, his words dripping with a subtle arrogance that made Aurora's skin crawl. Alessandro listened, his expression unreadable, his eyes occasionally flicking towards Aurora, a silent warning to keep her in line. The other family members chimed in, offering their congratulations, their support, their veiled expressions of envy and resentment. Aurora felt suffocated, trapped in a web of lies and hypocrisy. She wanted to scream, to expose the darkness that lurked beneath the surface of their glamorous world, but she knew it was futile. She had to play the game, to bide her time, to trust Isabella's plan, whatever it may be. As the dinner drew to a close, Alessandro rose from his seat, his gaze sweeping over the assembled family members. "Tonight, we celebrate a new beginning," he said, his voice booming through the room. "A union that will strengthen our families, secure our future, and ensure our dominance." He raised his glass, his eyes locking with Lorenzo's. "To the alliance between the Durasis and the Veronas," he said. "To a future of power and prosperity." The others echoed his toast, their glasses clinking together, the sound ringing through the room like a death knell. Aurora felt a chill run down her spine, a premonition of the darkness that was to come. After dinner, Lorenzo approached Isabella, his smile smooth and charming, his eyes filled with a possessive gleam. "May I have the pleasure of a walk in the gardens?" he asked, his voice a silky whisper, his hand outstretched toward her. Isabella hesitated for a moment, her gaze flickering towards Aurora, a silent question in her eyes. Aurora nodded, a subtle reassurance, urging her to go along with it, to play the game. Isabella accepted Lorenzo's hand, her expression carefully guarded, her body language radiating a subtle reluctance. They walked out of the dining room, leaving Aurora alone with Alessandro. "She's a beautiful girl," Alessandro said, his voice a low rumble, his eyes fixed on Aurora. "Strong-willed, like her mother." "She's not a possession, father," Aurora said, her voice tight with controlled anger. "She's a person, with her own thoughts, her own feelings, her own desires." Alessandro chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "Sentimentality is a weakness, Aurora," he said. "Something you should have learned by now." "And what about love?" she asked, her voice challenging him. "Is that a weakness, too?" He didn't answer, his gaze shifting away from hers, his expression unreadable. He knew, as well as she did, that love had been the driving force behind her flight, the reason she had sacrificed everything to protect her daughter. "Trust me, Aurora," he said finally, his voice softer now, tinged with a weariness that she had never heard before. "I'm doing what's best for the family. For all of us." "And what about what's best for Isabella?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He didn't answer, his silence a heavy weight in the room. Aurora knew that she couldn't trust him, that his promises were empty, that his only concern was for the family's power, the family's legacy. Later that night, after everyone had retired to their rooms, Aurora slipped out of her bed, her heart pounding in her chest. She had to talk to Isabella to find out what she was planning, to make sure she was safe. She crept through the silent corridors, her footsteps muffled by the thick carpets, her senses on high alert. She reached Isabella's door, pausing for a moment, listening for any sound from within. She heard whispers, hushed voices, a muffled sob. Her heart clenched with fear. She pushed open the door, her eyes adjusting to the darkness. Isabella was standing by the window, her back to the door, her body trembling. And there, standing beside her, his arms wrapped around her, was Marco. Aurora froze, her mind reeling.
Marco.
The outsider. The forbidden lover. He was here, in the villa, risking everything to be with Isabella. They turned as Aurora entered, their faces illuminated by the moonlight, their expressions a mixture of surprise and fear.
"Mama?"
Isabella said, her voice a hesitant whisper, her eyes wide with alarm. "What's going on?" Aurora asked, her voice low and urgent, her gaze shifting between Isabella and Marco. Marco stepped forward, his posture defensive, his eyes filled with a mixture of defiance and desperation. "We're leaving," he said, his voice firm, resolute. "Tonight. We're running away. Running away." The words echoed in Aurora's mind, a mixture of hope and terror swirling within her. It was a dangerous plan, a reckless gamble, but it was also a chance for Isabella to escape, to find the happiness she deserved. But it was also a risk that could change everything for everyone. In their world, love like theirs, especially Marco's status, meant death. Chapter 13. A tapestry of lies unraveling. The air in Isabella's room crackled with tension, a mixture of fear, hope, and a desperate determination to escape the suffocating confines of the villa, of the life that had been predetermined for them. Aurora looked from Isabella to Marco, her mind racing, trying to process the implications of their plan. Running away was a dangerous gamble, a direct defiance of Alessandro's authority, a betrayal of the family's expectations. The consequences, if they were caught, would be severe, potentially deadly. "Are you sure about this?" Aurora asked, her voice trembling slightly, her gaze fixed on Isabella. "Do you understand the risks?" Isabella nodded, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and a fierce resolve that mirrored Aurora's own rebellious spirit. "I do," she said, her voice firm, unwavering. "I can't stay here, Mama. I can't marry Lorenzo. I can't live a lie." Her words were a confirmation of Aurora's own feelings, a validation of the choice she had made 20 years earlier. She had run to protect Isabella, to give her a chance at a different life. And now, Isabella was choosing to run, to fight for her own freedom, her own happiness. "We have a plan," Marco said, his voice low and urgent, his eyes scanning Aurora's face, assessing her trustworthiness. "We have a place to go, people who will help us. We can disappear, start a new life, somewhere far away from here." Aurora's heart pounded in her chest. It was a reckless plan, a desperate gamble, but it was also a chance, a sliver of hope that maybe, just maybe, they could escape the darkness that surrounded them. But she also knew the dangers, the resources of the de Rossi and Verona families, the reach of their power.
"How?"
Aurora asked, her voice barely a whisper, her mind struggling to grasp the logistics of their escape. "How will you get out of the villa? How will you avoid being followed?" Marco explained their plan, a carefully orchestrated sequence of events involving a secret passage, a waiting car, a network of contacts who were willing to help them disappear. It was a risky plan with 1,000 things that could go wrong, but it was also their only chance. As Marco spoke, Aurora's gaze shifted to Isabella, studying her face, searching for any sign of doubt, any hesitation. But Isabella's eyes were clear, resolute, filled with a love for Marco that transcended everything else. "I'm ready," Isabella said, her voice firm, her hand reaching out to take Marco's, their fingers interlacing, a symbol of their unity, their determination. Aurora felt a surge of pride for her daughter, a fierce, protective love that overwhelmed her fear. Isabella was strong, courageous, willing to risk everything for the chance at a different life. "All right," Aurora said, her voice trembling but firm. "Let's do it." They put their plan into action, moving quickly and silently, their hearts pounding in their chests. Aurora retrieved the small, antique pistol she had kept hidden for 20 years, the weight of it in her hand a chilling reminder of the world she had tried to escape. They crept through the darkened corridors, their senses on high alert, listening for any sound that might betray their escape. They reached the secret passage, a narrow, dusty tunnel that led from the villa to the outside world, a passage that had been used for generations by members of the family to escape their enemies. As they were about to enter the passage, a voice rang out from the shadows, a voice that sent a chill of dread down Aurora's spine. "Going somewhere?" Tommaso stepped out of the darkness, his expression impassive, his eyes fixed on Aurora. He was holding a gun, the moonlight glinting off the cold steel. Aurora froze, her heart sinking. They had been discovered. Their plan had failed. Tommaso, her father's most trusted enforcer, The man she had once considered a friend was now their captor, their executioner. Tommaso, Aurora said, her voice trembling, trying to appeal to some remnant of the loyalty, the friendship they had once shared.
Please.
Let them go. Tommaso shook his head, his expression unyielding. I can't do that, Aurora, he said. You know I can't. He'll kill them, Aurora said, her voice desperate, pleading. He'll kill Marco, and he'll force Isabella to marry Lorenzo. Tommaso's gaze flickered, a brief flash of something that looked like regret crossing his features. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by the familiar, impenetrable mask. I have my orders, he said, his voice devoid of any emotion. I have to bring them back. No, Isabella said, her voice firm, resolute. She stepped forward, shielding Marco with her body. We're not going back. She looked at Aurora, her eyes filled with a silent plea. Trust me, Mama. Remember. Aurora understood. Isabella had a plan. She had anticipated this. She had foreseen Tommaso's intervention. And she was ready to fight. Isabella lunged at Tommaso, her movements swift and unexpected. She knocked the gun from his hand, the weapon clattering to the floor. Tommaso, caught off guard, stumbled backward. It was a betrayal of loyalty, of duty, but not of Aurora's. A faint glimmer of hope, a surprise move, and the entire tapestry of lies, so carefully woven, unraveled a bit more. Chapter 14. The storm breaks, the masks fall. The moment Isabella knocked the gun from Tommaso's hand, chaos erupted. Marco, seizing the opportunity, tackled Tommaso to the ground, the two men grappling in a fierce struggle for control. Aurora, her heart pounding in her chest, grabbed the fallen pistol, her hand trembling as she pointed it at Tommaso, her finger hovering over the trigger. Don't move, Tommaso, she said, her voice shaking but firm. Don't make me do this. Tommaso looked up at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of surprise, betrayal, and a grudging respect. He knew she was capable of it, that she would do anything to protect her daughter. Aurora, he said, his voice low and urgent.
Don't.
You don't understand. I understand perfectly, Aurora said, her voice hardening. I understand that you're loyal to my father, that you'll do anything he asks, even if it means destroying Isabella's life. It's not that simple, Tommaso said, his gaze flickering towards Isabella, who was standing protectively over Marco, her eyes filled with a fierce determination. There's more at stake here than you know. Then tell me, Aurora said, her voice demanding. Tell me what's going on. Tell me why you're doing this. Tommaso hesitated, his eyes darting around the corridor, as if afraid of being overheard. He lowered his voice, leaning closer to Aurora. It's not Alessandro, he said, his voice a barely audible whisper. It's Lorenzo. He's not who he seems. He's dangerous. Aurora's mind reeled. Lorenzo? The charming, charismatic suitor? The man who was supposed to unite the two families, to bring peace and prosperity? He was the threat? What do you mean? Aurora asked, her voice hesitant, her grip on the pistol tightening. He's planning something, Tommaso said, his voice urgent. Something big. Something that will destroy everything. He's not interested in an alliance. He wants revenge. Revenge. The word echoed in Aurora's mind, a chilling reminder of the generations of bloodshed, the hatred that had defined the relationship between the Durasis and the Veronas. Lorenzo was not seeking peace. He was seeking to destroy them, to avenge the past. And Isabella? Aurora asked, her voice barely a whisper, her fear for her daughter overwhelming her. What about her? She's the key, Tommaso said, his eyes filled with a desperate plea. He needs her. He needs her to complete his plan.
The key.
The same words Alessandro had used. But now they had a different meaning, a more sinister implication. Isabella was not just a pawn in a power game. She was a tool, a weapon, to be used by Lorenzo to achieve his ultimate goal. We have to stop him, Aurora said, her voice firm, resolute. We have to protect Isabella. Tommaso nodded, his eyes meeting hers, a silent understanding passing between them. They were on the same side now, united by a common goal, a shared purpose. I'll help you, Tommaso said, his voice low and even. But we have to be careful. He has eyes everywhere. He has spies within the family.
Spies.
The word sent a shiver down Aurora's spine. They were surrounded by enemies, betrayed by those they thought they could trust. Who? Aurora asked, her voice urgent. Who can we trust? Tommaso hesitated, his gaze flickering towards the shadows, as if afraid of being overheard. Not many, he said. But there are a few. We have to find them. We have to work together. They helped Marco to his feet, the three of them standing together, united against a common enemy. The storm had broken, the masks had fallen, and the true nature of the game had been revealed. It was a game of deception, of betrayal, of revenge, a game with deadly consequences. But they were ready to fight. They were ready to protect Isabella, to protect themselves, to protect the future from the darkness that threatened to consume them. The alliance, forged in that darkened hallway, would be their shield, their strength. But the enemies were many, and the path was unclear. And a deep rumble of thunder sounded from the distance. Chapter 15. Blood on the altar, tears in the rain. The distant rumble of thunder echoed the turmoil within Aurora's heart. The alliance with Tommaso, forged in the crucible of shared danger and a desperate need to protect Isabella, was a fragile, untested thing. But it was all they had. We need to get Isabella out of here, Aurora said, her voice urgent, her mind racing, trying to formulate a plan. Before Lorenzo realizes what's happening. He already suspects something, Tommaso said, his expression grim. He's been watching her, watching all of us. He's not a fool. Then we have to move quickly, Marco said, his voice firm, resolute. He looked at Isabella, his eyes filled with a fierce love and determination. We have to get you to safety. Isabella nodded, her expression mirroring Marco's, her hand reaching out to take his, their fingers interlacing, a symbol of their unity, their unwavering commitment to each other. There's a safe house, Tommaso said, his voice low and even. Not far from here. It's been used by the family for generations. It's hidden secure. We can get Isabella there, and then we can figure out what to do next. They made their way through the villa, moving quickly and silently, their senses on high alert. The storm was getting closer, the thunder louder, the lightning illuminating the darkened corridors with flashes of eerie light. As they reached the main entrance hall, they heard voices, raised in anger, coming from Alessandro's study. They paused, listening, their hearts pounding in their chests. I told you to keep an eye on her. Alessandro's voice boomed, filled with rage. I told you she was a threat. I did everything I could, another voice replied, a voice Aurora recognized as belonging to one of her cousins, a man named Giovanni, a man she had always distrusted. She's resourceful. Resourceful?
Alessandro scoffed.
She's a traitor. And you let her escape. She didn't escape, Giovanni said, his voice defensive. She's still in the villa.
I have searching for her.
Aurora's blood ran cold. They knew. They knew about Isabella's plan. They knew about Marco. They knew about Aurora's involvement. They were trapped. We have to go, Marco said, his voice urgent, pulling Isabella towards the front door.
Now.
They burst out of the villa, running into the storm-swept night. The rain was coming down in sheets, the wind whipping their hair and clothes, the thunder crashing overhead. They ran towards the waiting car, the getaway vehicle that Marco had arranged. But as they reached the car, they saw them. Lorenzo's men. They were everywhere, surrounding the car, their faces grim, their weapons drawn. Lorenzo himself stood at the front, his charming smile replaced by a cold, ruthless expression, his eyes filled with a chilling satisfaction. Going somewhere? He asked, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Isabella screamed, a sound of pure terror, as Marco pushed her behind him, shielding her with his body. Run, Isabella. Marco shouted, his voice desperate.
Run.
He lunged at Lorenzo's men, fighting with a fierce determination, trying to create a diversion, to give Isabella a chance to escape. But there were too many of them. They overwhelmed him, their fists and weapons raining down on him, beating him to the ground. Aurora screamed, trying to reach Marco, to help him, but Tommaso held her back, his grip like iron. "It's too late," he said, his voice filled with a grim resignation. "He's gone." Aurora watched in horror as Lorenzo's men dragged Marco's lifeless body away, his blood staining the rain-soaked ground. Tears streamed down her face, mingling with the rain, her heart shattered into a million pieces. Lorenzo approached Isabella, his eyes gleaming with triumph. He grabbed her arm, his grip cruel and possessive. "You belong to me now," he said, his voice a low, menacing growl. Isabella struggled, fighting against him, her eyes filled with hatred and defiance. But he was too strong. He dragged her towards the villa, her screams echoing through the stormy night. Aurora watched, her body trembling with rage and grief, her heart filled with a desperate need for revenge. Lorenzo had taken everything from her, her daughter, her hope, her future. But she wouldn't give up. She wouldn't surrender. She would fight. She would find a way to rescue Isabella, to avenge Marco's death, to destroy Lorenzo and everything he stood for. The storm had broken, and now so would she. It was blood on the altar, tears in the rain, and the fight for everything would begin. Chapter 16. The Ghost of Yesterday, the Hope of Tomorrow. The image of Marco's lifeless body, dragged away by Lorenzo's men, seared itself into Aurora's mind, a constant, agonizing reminder of her failure, of the price of her defiance. The rain continued to fall, a relentless downpour that mirrored the torrent of grief and rage that consumed her. Tommaso held her back, his grip firm but gentle, his presence a silent source of strength in the midst of the overwhelming despair. He knew the pain she was feeling, the guilt, the helplessness. He had seen it before, countless times, in the brutal world they inhabited. "We have to go," he said, his voice low and urgent, pulling her away from the scene of horror. "We can't stay here." Aurora resisted, her body trembling with rage, her heart filled with a desperate need for revenge. "I have to go back," she said, her voice hoarse, choked with emotion. "I have to save Isabella." "There's nothing you can do for her now," Tommaso said, his voice firm but compassionate. "She's in Lorenzo's hands. We have to regroup, to plan, to find a way to get her back." He led her away from the villa, towards the shelter of the trees, his hand guiding her through the darkness, the storm raging around them. They reached the safe house, a small, unassuming cottage hidden deep in the woods, a place that had been used by the family for generations as a refuge, a sanctuary. The cottage was sparsely furnished, but it was dry and warm, a welcome respite from the storm. Tommaso lit a fire in the hearth, the flames casting flickering shadows on the walls, creating a sense of fragile security. Aurora sat by the fire, her body shivering, her mind numb with shock and grief. She stared into the flames, her thoughts consumed by images of Marco, of Isabella, of the violence and betrayal that had shattered their lives. "He killed him," she said, her voice barely a whisper, her eyes filled with tears. "He killed Marco in cold blood." Tommaso nodded, his expression grim, his silence a shared acknowledgement of the brutal reality of their situation. He knew Lorenzo's capacity for cruelty, his ruthlessness, his insatiable thirst for revenge. "We will avenge him," Tommaso said, his voice firm, resolute. "We will make Lorenzo pay for what he's done." His words were a promise, a vow, a commitment to justice, to retribution. Aurora looked at him, her eyes searching his face, seeking some reassurance, some hope in the midst of the overwhelming darkness. She saw a flicker of something in his eyes, something that went beyond loyalty, beyond duty. She saw compassion, empathy, a shared grief for the loss they had suffered, a shared determination to fight for what was right.
"How?"
she asked, her voice hesitant, her mind struggling to grasp the enormity of the task ahead. "How can we possibly defeat him? He has all the power, all the resources. We have something he doesn't have," Tommaso said, his voice low and even. "We have the truth. We know his secrets. We know his plans. He told her everything, revealing the intricate web of deception and betrayal that Lorenzo had woven. He told her about Lorenzo's plan to use Isabella as a pawn in his quest for revenge, to destroy the Derossi family from within, to claim their power, their legacy. He told her about the spies within the family, the traitors who had betrayed them, the allies Lorenzo had cultivated, the network of power he had amassed. It was a chilling revelation, a testament to Lorenzo's cunning, his ruthlessness, his ambition. But Tommaso also told her about the resistance, the few remaining members of the family who were loyal to Alessandro, who were willing to fight back, to defy Lorenzo. He told her about the secret alliances they had formed, the plans they had made, the resources they had gathered. It was a glimmer of hope, a fragile possibility that they could still win, that they could still save Isabella, that they could still avenge Marco's death. "We have to find them," Aurora said, her voice firm, resolute. "We have to unite the resistance. We have to fight back." Tommaso nodded, his eyes meeting hers, a silent understanding passing between them. They were in this together, united by a common goal, a shared purpose. They were the ghost of yesterday, the remnants of a shattered past, but they were also the hope of tomorrow, the seeds of a new beginning. Their past, their shared experiences, were now fully aligned and would be used to forge a new future, a future hopefully free of Lorenzo. Chapter 17. A bridge of ashes and regret. The fire in the hearth crackled, casting flickering shadows on the walls of the safe house, a small island of warmth and fragile security in the midst of the storm-ravaged night. Aurora and Tommaso sat in silence, their thoughts consumed by the enormity of the task ahead, the dangers they faced, the uncertain future that stretched before them. Aurora's mind reeled with the revelations Tommaso had shared, the intricate web of deception and betrayal that Lorenzo had woven, the chilling scope of his ambition, his ruthlessness. She felt a surge of anger, a fierce determination to fight back, to avenge Marco's death, to rescue Isabella from Lorenzo's clutches. But she also felt a deep sense of regret, a gnawing guilt for the choices she had made, the mistakes she had committed. She had run away 20 years earlier, seeking to protect Isabella from the darkness of the mafia world, but she had only succeeded in abandoning her, leaving her vulnerable to the very forces she had tried to escape. "It's my fault," she said, her voice barely a whisper, her eyes filled with tears. "If I hadn't left, if I had stayed, maybe I could have prevented this." Tommaso looked at her, his expression filled with a mixture of compassion and a quiet understanding. He had witnessed her struggles, her sacrifices, her desperate attempts to protect her daughter. He knew the burden of guilt she carried, the weight of her regrets. "You did what you thought was best," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "You couldn't have known what would happen. No one could have predicted Lorenzo's treachery." "But I should have known," Aurora insisted, her voice shaking with emotion. "I should have seen the signs. I should have been there for her." "You can't change the past, Aurora," Tommaso said. "You can only learn from it. You can only fight for the future." His words were a comfort, a reassurance, a reminder that she was not alone in this fight. He was there with her, sharing the burden, offering his strength, his loyalty, his unwavering support. "What do we do now?" Aurora asked, her voice hesitant, her mind struggling to formulate a plan, to find a way forward. "We gather the resistance," Tommaso said, his voice firm, resolute. "We reach out to those who are still loyal to Alessandro, to those who oppose Lorenzo. We unite them, we organize them, we prepare for war." He outlined his plan, a carefully considered strategy to expose Lorenzo's treachery, to rally the family against him, to rescue Isabella, to reclaim their power, their legacy. It was a dangerous plan, fraught with risk, but it was their only chance.
"There's a meeting," Tommaso said.
"Tomorrow night. A gathering of those who are still loyal. It's our chance to present our case, to expose Lorenzo, to win them over to our side." "Where?" Aurora asked, her voice urgent. "Where is it being held?" "At the old church," Tommaso said. "San Giorgio. It's a sacred place, a place of sanctuary. It's the only place we can be sure of our safety. The old church. San Giorgio." Aurora remembered it well. It was a place of childhood memories, of whispered prayers, of a faith that had been tested but not broken. It was a symbol of hope, of resilience, of a community that had endured despite the darkness that surrounded it. "We'll be there," Aurora said, her voice firm, resolute. "We'll be ready." They spent the rest of the night preparing, planning, strategizing. They reviewed the list of names Tommaso had compiled, the names of those who were still loyal, those who could be trusted, those who might be willing to join their cause. It was a small list, a fragile alliance, but it was all they had. They were a bridge of ashes and regret, built upon the ruins of their past, but they were also a bridge to the future, a path to redemption, to justice, to a world free from Lorenzo's tyranny. As the dawn broke, casting a pale, ethereal light through the windows of the safe house, Aurora felt a surge of determination, a renewed sense of purpose. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world washed clean, a world filled with both danger and possibility. They were ready to face whatever came next. The bridge, however fragile, would hold. Chapter 18. The heart remembers what the mind forgets. The journey to the old church of San Giorgio was fraught with tension, every shadow seeming to conceal a potential threat, every sound amplifying the sense of danger that surrounded them. Aurora and Tommaso moved silently through the pre-dawn streets of Rome, their senses on high alert, their footsteps echoing softly on the cobblestones. The city was slowly awakening, the first rays of sunlight painting the ancient buildings with a golden hue, a stark contrast to the darkness that lurked in their hearts, the perilous mission that lay ahead. Aurora's mind was filled with a mixture of fear and determination. She was afraid of what might happen, of the risks they were taking, of the potential for failure. But she was also determined to fight, to rescue Isabella, to avenge Marco's death, to expose Lorenzo's treachery. She thought of Isabella, her daughter, her reason for everything. She imagined her trapped in the villa, a prisoner of Lorenzo's, her spirit unbroken, her courage unwavering. She clung to the hope that Isabella was safe, that she was still fighting, that she would find a way to survive. She also thought of Marco, his lifeless body lying in the rain-soaked ground, his sacrifice a constant, agonizing reminder of the stakes they were facing. She vowed to honor his memory, to fight for the justice he deserved, to ensure that his death would not be in vain. As they approached the church, Aurora felt a sense of familiarity, a wave of memories washing over her. She remembered attending Mass there as a child, her small hand clasped in her mother's, the scent of incense filling the air, the sound of the choir echoing through the vaulted ceilings. It was a place of peace, of sanctuary, of a faith that had sustained her through the darkest moments of her life. But it was also a place of secrets, of hidden passages, of a history intertwined with the dark underbelly of the city, the world of the Mafia. Tommaso led her to a side entrance, a small, unassuming door hidden in the shadows. He produced a key, an ancient, ornate piece of metal, and unlocked the door, the hinges groaning in protest as it swung open. They stepped inside, the air cool and damp, the silence broken only by the faint drip of water from the leaky roof. The church was dimly lit, the stained glass windows casting colorful patterns on the stone floor, the flickering candles illuminating the statues of saints and angels, their faces serene, their eyes seemingly watching them. There were already people gathered there, a small group of men and women, their faces etched with a mixture of fear, determination, and a quiet hope. They were the remnants of the resistance, the few who had remained loyal to Alessandro, the few who dared to defy Lorenzo. Aurora recognized some of them, faces from her past, cousins, uncles, old family friends. Others were strangers, their faces unfamiliar, but their eyes filled with the same fierce resolve, the same unwavering commitment to the cause. Tommaso introduced Aurora to the group, his voice low and even, his words carefully chosen. He explained her presence, her connection to Isabella, her role in their plan to expose Lorenzo, to reclaim their power, their legacy. The group listened, their expressions a mixture of curiosity, skepticism, and a cautious hope. They had heard rumors, whispers of Aurora's return, of her defiance, of her alliance with Tommaso. They were wary, uncertain, but they were also desperate for a leader, for someone to guide them, to unite them, to give them a chance to fight back. Aurora stepped forward, her heart pounding in her chest, her voice trembling slightly. She looked at the faces before her, the faces of those who had suffered, who had lost, who had endured. She saw their pain, their fear, their hope. "I know what you've been through," she said, her voice gaining strength, her words resonating with a raw emotion that came from the depths of her soul. "I know the darkness of our world, the brutality, the betrayal. I've lived it. I've suffered it. I've lost everything because of it." She told them her story, her flight from the villa, her years in hiding, her return, her discovery of Lorenzo's treachery, her desperate attempt to save Isabella, Marco's sacrifice. She spoke with a passion, a conviction, a vulnerability that touched their hearts, that broke down their barriers, that forged a connection between them. "I'm not here to ask you to risk your lives for me," she said. "I'm here to ask you to fight for yourselves, for your families, for your future. I'm here to ask you to join me in exposing Lorenzo, in reclaiming our power, in rescuing Isabella, in building a world free from his tyranny." Her words hung in the air, a challenge, a plea, an invitation. The group looked at each other, their eyes searching, their hearts weighing the risks, the potential rewards. Then, one by one, they stepped forward, their faces firm, resolute, their voices pledging their loyalty, their support, their commitment to the cause. They were a small band, a fragile alliance, but they were united, determined, ready to fight. The heart remembered what the mind had tried to forget, that they would do whatever it took. Whatever
it took.
Chapter 19. Redemption in the Face of Ruin. The alliance forged in the hushed sanctuary of San Giorgio Church was a fragile thing, built on shared grief, a desperate hope for redemption, and a fierce determination to overthrow Lorenzo's reign of terror. Aurora, standing at the heart of this nascent resistance, felt the weight of responsibility, the burden of leadership, but also a surge of renewed purpose, a conviction that they could, against all odds, succeed. Tommaso, ever the strategist, outlined the plan, a multi-pronged approach designed to expose Lorenzo's treachery, to dismantle his power base, to rescue Isabella from his clutches. It was a dangerous plan, fraught with risk, but it was their only chance. They would gather evidence of Lorenzo's crimes, his manipulations, his betrayals. They would expose his lies to the family, to the wider network of allies and associates, to undermine his support, to turn them against him. They would use their connections, their resources, their knowledge of the city's underworld to disrupt his operations, to weaken his grip on power. And, most importantly, they would find a way to rescue Isabella, to get her out of the villa, to protect her from Lorenzo's clutches. It was the most dangerous part of the plan, the most emotionally charged, the one that fueled Aurora's every waking moment. They divided the tasks, assigning responsibilities, leveraging each individual's strengths and expertise. Some would focus on gathering intelligence, uncovering Lorenzo's secrets, documenting his crimes. Others would work on spreading disinformation, planting rumors, sowing seeds of doubt among his supporters. Still others would focus on the logistics of the rescue operation, planning the escape route, securing safe houses, preparing for the inevitable confrontation. Aurora, with Tommaso by her side, would lead the charge, coordinating the efforts, making the crucial decisions, rallying the troops, inspiring them to fight, to believe in the possibility of victory. The days that followed were a blur of activity, a whirlwind of clandestine meetings, whispered conversations, secret exchanges of information. They moved through the city like shadows, avoiding detection, communicating in code, using every precaution to protect their fragile alliance from Lorenzo's spies. They uncovered evidence of Lorenzo's treachery, his manipulation of family finances, his involvement in Marco's murder, his plans to use Isabella as a pawn in his quest for ultimate power. They documented everything, gathering the proof they needed to expose him, to bring him down. They also discovered the extent of Lorenzo's network, the spies he had planted within the family, the allies he had cultivated, the resources he had amassed. It was a daunting realization, a testament to his cunning, his ruthlessness, his ambition. But they also found unexpected allies, individuals who had grown disillusioned with Lorenzo's rule, who had witnessed his brutality, who were secretly yearning for a return to the old ways, to a semblance of honor, of justice. These new allies provided crucial information, inside knowledge, access to resources that strengthened their position, that gave them a fighting chance. They were a testament to the enduring power of loyalty, of family, of a shared belief in a better future. As the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, Aurora felt a growing sense of hope, a conviction that they were on the right track, that they were gaining momentum, that they could actually achieve their goals. But she also knew that the final confrontation was looming, the inevitable showdown with Lorenzo, the moment of truth that would determine their fate, Isabella's fate, the fate of the entire family. She prepared herself, mentally, emotionally, physically. She practiced with the pistol, honing her skills, steeling her nerves, preparing for the violence that she knew was coming. She drew strength from Tommaso, from the other members of the resistance, from the memory of Marco, from the unwavering belief in her daughter's courage, her resilience. She was ready. They were ready. The time for redemption, in the face of utter ruin, was at hand. The ruin that was coming would cleanse. Chapter 20. The final reckoning of souls entwined. The night of the final confrontation arrived, a night filled with a palpable tension, a sense of impending doom, but also a flicker of defiant hope. Aurora, Tommaso, and the small band of resistance fighters gathered in the shadows near the Derossi villa, their faces grim, their hearts pounding in their chests, their weapons concealed but ready. The plan was intricate, a carefully orchestrated sequence of events designed to exploit Lorenzo's arrogance, his overconfidence, his belief that he was untouchable. They would infiltrate the villa, expose his treachery to the assembled family members and allies, rescue Isabella, and, if necessary, eliminate Lorenzo himself. It was a suicide mission, a desperate gamble, but they were prepared to risk everything. They had come too far, lost too much, to turn back now. They were fighting for their lives, for their future, for the soul of their family. Aurora, dressed in black, her pistol concealed beneath her cloak, felt a surge of adrenaline, a mixture of fear and a fierce determination. She looked at Tommaso, his face etched with a quiet resolve, his eyes reflecting the same unwavering commitment to the cause. They exchanged a silent nod, a shared understanding, a bond forged in the crucible of shared danger and a desperate hope for redemption. They were ready. They slipped into the villa, moving like shadows through the familiar corridors, their footsteps muffled by the thick carpets, their senses on high alert. They knew the layout of the villa intimately, the secret passages, the hidden rooms, the escape routes. They reached the grand ballroom, where a lavish party was in full swing, a macabre celebration of Lorenzo's impending triumph, his consolidation of power. The room was filled with family members, allies, associates, all oblivious to the storm that was about to break, the reckoning that was about to unfold. Lorenzo stood at the center of the room, surrounded by his sycophants, his charming facade firmly in place, his eyes gleaming with a cold, ruthless ambition. Isabella stood beside him, her face pale, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and a defiant resolve. Aurora's heart ached at the sight of her daughter, trapped in Lorenzo's clutches, a pawn in his deadly game. She felt a surge of rage, a fierce determination to rescue her, to free her from this nightmare. Tommaso gave the signal, and the resistance fighters moved into action. They dispersed through the room, positioning themselves strategically, their weapons concealed but ready. Aurora stepped forward, her voice ringing out through the room, silencing the music, the chatter, the laughter. "Lorenzo Verona," she said, her voice amplified by the sudden silence, her words dripping with accusation, with contempt. "You are a traitor, a murderer, a liar." The room erupted in chaos, a cacophony of gasps, shouts, protests. Lorenzo's smile vanished, replaced by a mask of fury, his eyes narrowing with a cold, murderous rage. "Seize her," he shouted, his voice booming through the room. "Kill them all." His men lunged forward, their weapons drawn, but the resistance fighters were ready. They met the attack with a fierce determination, a coordinated assault that caught Lorenzo's forces off guard. The ballroom became a battlefield, a scene of chaos and violence, the clash of steel, the crack of gunfire, the screams of the injured and the dying. Aurora fought with a ferocity she didn't know she possessed, her pistols spitting fire, her movements swift and precise. She was fighting for her daughter, for her future, for the soul of her family. Tommaso fought beside her, his movements a blur of lethal grace, his weapon dispatching Lorenzo's men with ruthless efficiency. He was a warrior, a protector, a force of nature. They moved towards Isabella, cutting a path through the chaos, their eyes locked on their target. Lorenzo saw them coming, his face contorted with rage, his eyes filled with a desperate, cornered animal ferocity. He grabbed Isabella, pulling her in front of him as a shield, his arm around her throat, a knife pressed against her skin. "Stop," he shouted, his voice hoarse, desperate. "Or I'll kill her." Aurora froze, her heart stopping in her chest. She looked at Isabella, her eyes filled with terror, but also with a silent plea, a message of courage, of resilience. "Let her go, Lorenzo," Aurora said, her voice trembling, but firm. "It's over. You've lost." Lorenzo laughed, a chilling, manic sound that echoed through the room. "I've lost nothing," he shouted. "I have everything. I have the power. I have the family. I have her." "You have nothing," Aurora said, her voice rising in defiance. "You have only hatred, only darkness, only death." She raised her pistol, her hand trembling, her finger tightening on the trigger. She had a clear shot, a chance to end it all, to kill Lorenzo, to save Isabella. But she hesitated. She couldn't do it. She couldn't take a life, even to save her own daughter. She couldn't become the monster she was fighting. Isabella saw her hesitation, her struggle. She understood, and she made her choice. With a sudden, swift movement, she elbowed Lorenzo in the stomach, breaking his grip, freeing herself from his grasp. She stepped aside, leaving Lorenzo exposed, vulnerable. Tommaso seized the opportunity. He fired his weapon, the bullet striking Lorenzo in the chest, sending him crashing to the floor, his lifeless eyes staring up at the ceiling. The room fell silent, the chaos subsiding, the battle over. Lorenzo was dead. Isabella was safe. The reckoning was complete. But it was not a joyous end. It was a grim, painful finality. A reminder that this world they had fought in had come at a great cost. Tommaso held Aurora, both their faces marked by the battle they had fought, their future uncertain. Epilogue. The aftermath of the battle at the villa was a period of mourning, of healing, of rebuilding. The de Rossi family, shattered by Lorenzo's treachery and the ensuing violence, struggled to come to terms with the losses they had suffered, the scars that would forever mark their lives. Aurora, with Tommaso by her side, took on the daunting task of leading the family, of guiding them through the treacherous waters of the mafia world, of trying to forge a new path, a future less defined by violence and betrayal. It was not an easy task. The old ways were deeply ingrained, the traditions, the codes, the expectations, a heavy burden that weighed upon them. There were those who resisted change, who clung to the past, who yearned for the days of power and dominance, regardless of the cost. But Aurora was determined to create a different future, a future where her family could live without fear, without the constant threat of violence, without the suffocating weight of their legacy. She focused on diversifying the family's interests, moving away from the illegal activities that had defined their past, investing in legitimate businesses, creating opportunities for the younger generation to pursue different paths, to escape the cycle of violence. She also worked to repair the relationships that had been damaged by Lorenzo's treachery, to rebuild trust, to forge new alliances, to create a sense of unity, of shared purpose. It was a slow, arduous process, filled with challenges, setbacks, and moments of doubt. But Aurora persevered, driven by her love for her family, by her commitment to creating a better future, by the memory of those they had lost. Isabella, initially traumatized by her ordeal, slowly began to heal, to find her own strength, her own voice. She had witnessed the darkness of their world firsthand, the brutality, the betrayal, the cost of power. But she had also seen the courage, the resilience, the love that had sustained them through the darkest moments. She chose to distance herself from the family business, to pursue her own passions, to create a life that was separate from the world of the mafia. She found solace in art, in music, in the beauty of the world around her, a world that had seemed so distant, so unattainable, during her years trapped in the villa. Aurora supported her daughter's choices, understanding her need for distance, for healing, for a life of her own. She knew that Isabella would always carry the scars of her past, but she also believed that she would find her own way, her own strength, her own happiness. Tommaso remained by Aurora's side, his loyalty unwavering, his support a constant source of strength. They had been through so much together, their bond forged in the crucible of shared danger, shared loss, shared hope. Their relationship evolved, deepening beyond the confines of duty, of loyalty, of shared purpose. They found solace in each other's company, a quiet understanding, a mutual respect, a love that had blossomed in the midst of darkness. They never married, never formalized their relationship, but they were partners, companions, soulmates, bound together by a shared past, a shared present, and a shared hope for the future. Years passed. The de Rossi family slowly began to heal, to rebuild, to redefine itself. The old ways faded, replaced by a new generation, a new vision, a new hope for a future free from the violence and betrayal that had defined their past. Aurora, her hair now completely silver, her face lined with the wisdom of years, her eyes still reflecting the strength and resilience that had carried her through so much, could finally look back on her life with a sense of peace, of acceptance, of a quiet satisfaction. She had made mistakes. She had suffered losses. She had endured unimaginable pain. But she had also fought. She had survived. She had triumphed. She had protected her daughter. She had avenged Marco's death. She had helped to create a better future for her family. She had found redemption, not in the grand gestures, the heroic acts, but in the small moments, the quiet acts of love, of loyalty, of courage. She had found redemption in the face of ruin, a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit, the unwavering hope for a better tomorrow. And though the ghosts of yesterday would always be with her, Aurora had learned that the hope of tomorrow, however fragile, was always worth fighting for. The cost was high, the betrayals many, but it all had led to this. And that was enough. The end.